War does not only break armies, it rewrites bodies and memories. It takes living beings with names and hopes and quiet mornings and compresses them into symbols, into legends, into masks, in the stories told after the guns fall silent. A life becomes a single image, a single sound, a single fear in the Clone Wars. One of those images is General Grievous, a towering cyborg in a bone-white mask, a hacking mechanical cough echoing through starship corridors, 4 metal arms unfolding with a shriek of servos and green and blue lightsabers, igniting in a spinning halo of death to most of the galaxy. He was a Separatist warlord, the supreme commander of a droid army, the nightmare that walked at the edge of every Jedi's vision. That is the legend. But legends are merciless. They strip away what came before the metal and the wheezing lungs, before the trophies of fallen Jedi. Clipped to his belt, there was a warrior with a different name, Qymaen Sheelal, a Kaleesh hunter who knew the taste of Kalee's red, dust and the sound of storms rolling in across bone fields. He had a people to defend enemies with Qymaen and claws, and a love who stood beside him in the dark. The story of General Grievous is not only the story of a monster, it is the story of a man pulled apart by war, rebuilt by conspiracy, and aimed like a weapon at the heart of a dying republic. What followed was a chain of choices and betrayals that would shape the final days of the Jedi Order and the rise of a new galactic empire. This journey begins on Kaleesh in the shadow of the Huk War, with Qymaen Sheelal leading his warriors against the Yamri, while the distant Republic and the Jedi look down and choose a side. Later it moves through the cold precision of the intergalactic banking clan, through a shuttle that never truly malfunctioned, and through the waiting hands of Count Dooku, who saw in a wounded Kaleesh general the perfect blade for the dark side. From there, the path descends into metal, and pain into Kaminoan operating, theaters and durasteel bones into the first ragged breaths of a cyborg whose heart still remembered Kaleesh, even as his body forgot it. What they found there would change everything. A commander who could match Jedi in combat, learn their forms, steal their weapons, and turn their own art against them for millennia to come. His image would haunt the margins of history, a reminder of how far the war had fallen tonight. This is the entire story, told slowly, from Qymaen Sheelal on Kaleesh to the coughing general on Utapau, from love and loyalty to fire and dust. The pace will be steady, the tone calm, the details unfolding like distant thunder. It is safe to drift in and out to let scenes rise and fade. The war will continue. The narrative will wait, and by the time sleep fully claims, the mask will have been lifted and the life behind it quietly laid to rest. To listen to a war story in the dark is to make a quiet agreement with time. The pace will slow. The noise of the galactic conflict will soften, and what remains will be a single life, followed from its first breath to its final spark of consciousness. This is the story of General Grievous, but it will not begin with the Clone Wars. It will begin far from Coruscant's light, on a humid red world called Kaleesh. There in jungles and bone deserts, in shrines carved from the skulls of hunted beasts, a child named Qymaen Sheelal learned what power meant long before any Sith ever spoke his name. The journey ahead will move in order, step by step. Through the years, it will linger first on Kaleesh itself, on the Kaleesh culture of masks and ancestral spirits. On the way, a young hunter stalked predators in the mist and returned with trophies that would shape his legend before the word General ever touched it. From there, the horizon will darken as the Huk War rises, insectoid raiders descending from the stars, the Republic looking away, the Jedi Order treating a distant tribal conflict as an inconvenience rather than a wound in the Force. What followed was famine, sanctions and mass graves on a world too far from the core to matter. After that will come the shuttle, the rain against the viewport, the sudden explosion that was called an accident but was in truth a quiet act of design, the intergalactic banking clan counting profits, Count Dooku watching from the shadows as broken flesh was offered a metal salvation. What they found there would change everything, not for the galaxy, not yet, but for one dying warrior who refused to die. The narrative will sink into that operating chamber, into the forging of the cyborg frame. The first mechanical breath, the first realization that speed, strength, and endurance had been purchased at the price of almost everything else. Then the training will begin. Dooku's blade tracing pale arcs through the air as he remade a Kaleesh warlord into a Jedi-killing weapon, 4 arms, 4 sabers, a style built from stolen forms and remembered hunts. Only then will the Clone Wars open fully campaigns on worlds whose names blur together in the dark corridors of history, fleets burning in orbit, Jedi falling one by one, their lightsabers taken and added to a growing collection, each hilt a small, quiet obituary. Through it all, one question will sit beneath the battles like a low, distant engine. Was Grievous born a monster, or was he carved into one by a galaxy that chose to ignore his people's suffering for millennia to come? Historians will argue the answer for now. It is enough to rest, to let eyes grow heavy as the timeline unfolds. Childhood war betrayal, reconstruction, Qymaen, and at last, Utapau and the echo of blaster fire in a hollow chest. The story will move forward at a measured pace, and sleep can arrive whenever it wishes. The war will not mind. A red world at the edge of the maps. Kaleesh, yet long before Utapau and the hollow thunder in a metal chest, there was only a red world at the edge of the maps, a place the Republic barely marked and rarely named. Kaleesh hung on the fringe of galactic awareness, distant, unimportant, and quietly brutal. Its skies burned with a permanent rust, tinged haze. The light of its star filtered through dust and ash, so that dawn arrived in shades of blood, and ember-jagged cliffs rose from the plains like broken teeth, their shadows stretching long across cracked earth. Below them, dense jungles breathed in slow, humid cycles, leaves heavy with moisture, insects humming in layered choruses far out on the coasts. Black rock met restless seas, and in those waters, vast-scaled predators moved just beneath the surface. Patient and unseen on the open plains, other hunters ruled massive reptilian beasts with horned crests and bone-plated hides, stalked herds at twilight, their roars rolling out across the land like distant thunder. Smaller pack creatures waited at the edges, drawn by the promise of the kill. And when the wind shifted, it carried dust, the iron scent of blood, and the dry rattle of withered grass. The planet itself felt like a living challenger, teaching quiet decree that only the strong would endure. This was the crucible that formed the Kaleesh. They were a proud and fiercely territorial people, tall, sinewy, and masked from early youth. Their bone masks were more than armor, more than decoration. Each one was a story of ancestry, shaped to echo the skulls of the great predators they hunted, etched with symbols that honored the dead. The story of a Kaleesh warrior began not with birth, but with the first time that mask was lowered over the face, and the world was seen through its narrow eye slits, around crackling campfires. Beneath those red skies, elders recited names of ancestors in long measured cadences, flames reflecting in carved bone and steady eyes. They spoke of hunts that lasted for days, of duels with jungle beasts whose claws could tear stone, of narrow escapes along storm-beaten cliffs. Every tale ended the same, with gratitude to those who had fallen before, and a reminder that the dead watched from beyond the veil of the Force isolation, shaped them. Scarcity refined them. Kali's harsh seasons could turn fertile ground to dust in a single cycle. Storms could strip the jungles bare and drive predators inland in waves. In this environment, clan meant survival. Loyalty was not an abstract virtue, but a daily necessity. Betrayal was unthinkable. Weakness, dangerous mercy. Carefully measured, this constant pressure would shape a culture that valued strength, cunning, and unwavering devotion to bloodline and tribe above any distant authority or shining galactic order to the Republic. It was only another remote world, another harsh landscape orbiting in the dark. Yet from these jungles and cliffs, from these masked hunters and quiet fireside oaths, would one day rise a warlord whose name would echo through the Clone Wars. And what followed was no accident. because on Kaleesh's wind-scoured plateaus, a child once listened to the thunder of distant beasts and learned a lesson that the Jedi would not understand until it was far too late. The boy, named Qymaen Sheelal. That child was Qymaen Sheelal, a Kaleesh boy, born beneath low clouds and red dust storms on the world the Republic would later call insignificant. He grew up listening to the drums of distant thunder and the slower drum of elders' voices around village fires, telling the story of hunters who never missed and warriors who never ran from the beginning. He watched more than he spoke. He studied the way flame bent in the wind, the way older hunters shifted their weight before a throw, the way silence fell when the names of dead heroes were spoken on. Kaleesh legend was not entertainment, it was instruction, and every tale carried a lesson about duty to clan and to the land itself. His first training did not begin with a weapon. It began with walking long, patient walks across jagged plateaus, tracking the faintest claw mark in stone, learning which broken reed meant a predator had passed, and which meant only the wind. The beasts of Kaleesh were massive armored things, with jaws like traps and hides like shields. To face them with recklessness was suicide. To face them with patience was survival. Qymaen learned to wait. He learned to slow his breathing until even the insects forgot he was there. He learned that a hunter who rushed wasted the kill and insulted the spirit of the beast. Every strike was meant to be clean, every death acknowledged with a quiet word. This was not mercy. In the Jedi sense, it was a harsh respect, an order older than any galactic empire. As he grew, his bond to Kaleesh deepened. He memorized the paths of the stormfronts, how certain cliffs sang before the rain. He traced the migrations of the great horned grazers and knew when their absence meant predators were near. During the long evenings, he watched artisans carve bone and chitin into the fierce Kaleesh masks that turned faces into legends. Each mask told the story of a life of battles survived and oaths kept in these rituals. His own face remained bare, but his role was already changing. During hunts, when older warriors argued over routes, Qymaen would quietly point to a ridgeline or a dry riverbed, and the beasts would appear exactly where he had predicted, in ambushes against lesser predators. He moved last, but saw first reading terrain, like an unwritten chronicle of danger. What followed was a slow recognition, not through titles or formal rank, but through glances, deferred questions asked in moments of fear. When storms rolled in and visibility vanished, Qymaen remained calm, his voice low, his instructions simple. He did not command through volume. He commanded through certainty. These qualities, discipline, focus, a fierce loyalty to land and people, would shape everything that came after. They were the same instincts that would one day guide war campaigns instead of hunting parties, the same patience that would track Jedi instead of beasts. And when the wider galaxy finally turned its indifferent gaze toward Kaleesh, what they found there would change everything, because the boy who honored every kill would be offered a different creed, one where death was no longer a solemn necessity, but a weapon of terror. And the next time Qymaen Sheelal put on a mask, it would not be carved from bone, but forged from metal and war. Masks, myths, and the Kaleesh way of war on Kaleesh War was never just a matter of survival. It was a language, a ritual, and a conversations with the dead. The Kaleesh believed that no warrior ever truly stood alone in battle. Each fighter carried their ancestors with them, not as an idea, but as a weight on the face. Their masks were carved from bone or chitin, shaped to echo the features of honored forebears and etched with the stories of great hunts. When a Kaleesh hunter went to war, he did so wearing the memory of those who had killed before him. These masks were not costumes. They were reliquaries between battles. They were cleaned with care, hung in family shrines and spoken to in low voices. A cracked mask was a wound to the whole bloodline. A destroyed mask was a second death. Even children learned to trace the grooves of those carvings, memorizing which line marked a slain predator and which symbol marked a fallen clanmate for thousands of years. This quiet reverence would shape how the Kaleesh understood violence. From that reverence grew a harsh code of honor, Courage was measured not by victory, but by the odds faced. A Kaleesh warrior was expected to stand when retreat was wiser, to shield clan and kin, even when defeat was certain. Dying in defense of Kaleesh was not tragic. It was correct. And in their oral history, what followed was always the same refrain. The land remembers, the loyal dead in this order. Qymaen Sheelal came of age. His first lessons were not about armies or empires. They were about the hunt, stalking great reptiles through crimson fog, learning to move only when the wind moved, learning to read the tension in muscle and the flicker of an eye. He learned that every creature revealed its weakness in the instant. Before it struck, battle was simply the hunt with louder consequences. As he grew older, those lessons shifted from beasts to armed foes. Qymaen learned to conserve motion, to let opponents exhaust themselves against a guard that never opened. He watched how a wounded enemy favored one leg, how fear made hands tighten on a spear. He killed quickly, not to show mercy, but to deny chaos. Every strike was deliberate, every movement economical. This was the story of a hunter taught to turn perception into power. Yet on Kaleesh, the same code that sanctified defense also fed blood feuds, an insult to a mask. A raid on a village, a defiled shrine could ignite generations of conflict. Sacred duty blurred into vengeance until no one remembered which blow had been first. When off-world invaders finally arrived, this ancient volatility met galactic technology, and what they found there would change everything, because the Kaleesh fought with spirit and soil, while their enemies brought metal hulls and distant engines. The cold logic of droids and starships had no place for ancestors or honor. It reduced war to numbers and supply lines, and one day Qymaen would command that kind of war. A hunter's instincts trapped inside a machine that had no shrine and no mask, only a metal face built for fear. When the sky filled with insects, the coming of the Huk, that metal face would not appear overnight. It would be forged in fire and in the shadow of wings that did not belong to any creature born on Kaleesh. Those wings arrived with the Yamriyi. The nearby world of Huk had long been a quiet name in Kaleesh. Legends, a distant star where insectoid shapes moved behind poisonous clouds when the first Huk ships descended through Kaleesh's atmosphere. The old stories suddenly walked out of myth and into the sky. They came in angular hulls that glinted like beetle carapaces, and when their hatches opened, Qymaen stepped out to claim the soil. The Yamri were tall and spindled their limbs, jointed like knives there. The bodies wrapped in natural armor that caught the red light of Kaleesh's sun. They moved with the methodical patience that predators did not share, because these were not hunters. These were slavers. They had tasted the power of off-world trade and easy conquest, and what they found there would change everything for the Kaleesh, for the Huk Empire. Kaleesh was not a sacred world of masks and ancestors. It was a resource vein waiting to be opened. They raided coastal villages first, dragging chains through the surf as Kaleesh fishers vanished into the holds of orbiting transports. They stripped ore from canyon walls and carved scars into hunting grounds that had been holy for generations. In their compound eyes, the Kaleesh were not warriors, they were labor. What followed was a new kind of terror the Kaleesh had always known. Conflict. They had fought predators that stalked the dunes and rival clans that challenged the old order. But those enemies bled and fell and answered to the same gravity the Huk brought droids that did not fear and rifles that spat light across impossible distances. They came from the sky and left in it, taking prisoners and metal and food in cold accounting outrage, spread faster than any storm shrines filled with offerings, not for a good hunt, but for survival clan leaders, gathered in dark caverns lit by oil. And by anger, old feuds were set aside as maps of the raided coasts were carved into stone. The story of the Kaleesh was changing, and every elder understood that this war would shape their people far beyond one generation. In the middle of this rising storm stood Qymaen Sheelal, no longer just the hunter who knew every breath of the desert wind. He became a war leader whose trophies were no longer fangs and claws, but broken Huk carapaces and captured rifles. The Force did not guide him. Yet no Jedi or Sith had touched his path, only discipline and fury, and a cold clarity that came from watching his villagers burn battle by battle. His skills shifted. He learned to read the rhythm of orbital raids, to strike supply lines instead of beasts, to turn Huk technology against its masters. But one night after driving back another incursion, Qymaen paused among the wreckage of a downed transport and looked up the stars above Kaleesh. No longer felt distant or holy. They felt hostile, arranged in paths that carried enemies from system to system. For the first time, he understood that the true enemy might not walk on Kaleesh soil at all. It might be waiting out there in the dark between worlds where new empires were already deciding the fate of his people. And the next time the sky filled with engines, it would not only be Qymaen that came for Kaleesh. Forged in the Huk War, from hunter to general, the paths in the sky had shown Qymaen that his world sat beneath unseen powers. But on the ground, the war against the Huk remained painfully simple. It was teeth against Qymaen, rifle against blaster line against swarm. The Yamri came with starfighters and shuttles with off-world weapons and mercenaries hired by distant credits. Yet they still had to land. They still had to walk into the jungles and across the red plains of Kaleesh. Here Qymaen's past as a hunter became his answer to their machines. He studied the rhythm of their patrols, the pitch of their engines, the way Huk squads bunched together. When afraid, he led small bands of Kaleesh through canyons and mangrove swamps, striking at night and vanishing before orbital support could find them. What followed was a campaign of ambushes, snares and feints that turned familiar ground into a weapon. He taught warriors to move like stalkers, not soldiers, to use decoys carved from bone to draw Huk fire, to bait them into ravines, seeded with explosives taken from captured caches. A single Huk walker might vanish into a sinkhole, its legs cut out from under it by shaped charges placed like hunting traps in the mud. These were not grand battles in the style of galactic holodramas. They were patient cuts, inflicted on a larger animal until it began to bleed out as his tactics spread. So did his name. Villages whispered about Qymaen Sheelal, the hunter who broke Huk formations with a handful of fighters and a single, well-timed charge raids on slave pens. Freed, captured Kaleesh elders and children, and each rescue carried his legend farther across the equatorial belt. In time, chieftains who had never seen his face began sending warriors to fight under his command, with every village saved and every ambush survived. His resolve hardened in the quiet moments between attacks. He walked the ruined fields of his homeworld and counted the empty houses in his mind, a single thought repeated like a mantra. Kaleesh would never again be prey if that required him to become something more ruthless, more relentless than any predator he had once hunted. Then that was the price around hastily drawn maps in torchlit caves. The other war leaders began to defer to him. They asked where to strike, how long to hold, when to fall back. They called him General. In everything but formal title, a center of gravity in a conflict that might otherwise have shattered into feuding clans. His presence gave the war a shape and an order, and for a time it seemed enough, yet the same qualities that made Qymaen a hero to Kaleesh did not go unnoticed beyond its atmosphere. In distant boardrooms and shadowed chambers, his efficiency appeared as a resource, his resolve as leverage to be turned by the dark side of galactic politics. The story of how that admiration became exploitation would shape not only his fate, but the next great war, Relcrae and the quiet heart of a warlord. On a world drowning in war, there was still room for quiet in the long nights between campaigns when the ash storms eased and the guns finally fell silent. Qymaen Sheelal shared those hours with a single constant presence, a female Kaleesh warrior named Relcrae. Her name moved through the camps like a low chant. She was known first for her aim and her blade, for the way her rifle spoke across the dunes and never wasted a shot. But Relcrae was more than a weapon. She read the enemy as easily as she read the weather. She argued strategy with clan chieftains and won. And when Qymaen's temper threatened to drag every conversation back to blood, she answered with maps, supply counts, and the simple question of who would eat when the next village burned. What followed was an unlikely balance rage and reason bound together in the same tent around their fire. The warlord and the huntress became something smaller, and more dangerous than legends. They became ordinary together. They shared thin stews from dented pots, passing the bowl back and forth, while the desert wind worried at the canvas above them. They spoke in low voices, not about glory, but about irrigation channels for the flooded lowland schools in the stone cities, and a day when Kaleesh children would know the sound of the sea instead of artillery in those pauses between battles. They carved masks side by side. Qymaen's hands moved with a predator's certainty, harsh angles, deep cuts. Relkrai's knife traced softer lines along the bone, adding tiny sigils for ancestors and victories that did not involve killing a small handprint for a rescued child, a spiral for a village saved. These were not trophies. They were a record of mercy in a culture that honored the hunt. Relkrai understood something that Qymaen often refused to see, that power without purpose would devour Kaleesh from within. When reports came of elders displaced and shrines shattered, she sat across from him in the dim light and reminded him that their enemies were not only the Huk, but hunger, disease, and despair. She spoke of the old stories, the ones that said a warrior who forgot the weak would be forgotten by the ancestors for millennia to come over time. Their bond became part of the story of the war. The tale told to new recruits. On cold nights, they were pointed toward the command tent and told that inside were two hearts, planning not conquest, but survival among a people ground down by sanctions and scarcity. The sight of Qymaen listening, head bowed, while Relkrai traced routes in the dust with her knife, became a symbol of hope. Yet in that same image lay a hidden fragility. The more Qymaen's quiet heart anchored itself to Relkrai's presence, the more any threat to her became unthinkable. And in a galaxy where empires moved in shadows, such attachments were noticed. The loss of that fire-lit circle, the empty space at his side would shape every choice he made afterward, and there were those already calculating how that fracture could be opened and used in the next great conflict. A war the galaxy pretended not to see power in the galaxy, rarely notices suffering until it becomes inconvenient, and on the far edges of the Republic, Kaleesh's suffering was distant noise beneath the hum of trade lanes and Senate debates. The Huk changed that not by mercy, but by narrative. They reached outward first in the gleaming corridors of the galactic core. The Yamri did not present themselves as slavers and raiders. They arrived as victims, as industrious insectoids, besieged by brutal Kaleesh warlords. They brought hollow-eyed delegations and carefully chosen hollows of burning Huk settlements, never showing the chains they had fastened on Kaleesh wrists, never mentioning the worlds they had stripped bare. The story of the Huk War that reached Coruscant was not one of resistance. It was one of alleged Kaleesh aggression reports, painted Qymaen's people as primitive conquerors, masked predators, sweeping out of their deserts to prey on peaceful neighbors. The nuance that the Huk had struck first, that they had taken Kaleesh off-world as chattel, was quietly filed away in subheadings and footnotes for the Republic. This was a border dispute on maps, in Senate briefing rooms. Kaleesh and Huk space were thin lines at the edge of larger trade routes, small annotations on star charts crowded. With more important worlds, what followed was a familiar pattern: committees' hearings, procedural delays. The language was calm, and distant phrases like regional destabilization and limited engagement wrapped a very real war in soft bureaucratic cloth. When the Jedi Order was finally drawn in, it was not with tales of Kaleesh heroism, but with requests to end alleged Kaleesh atrocities. Jedi Masters and Knights reviewed incomplete dispatches filtered through Huk envoys and Republic functionaries. They saw casualty numbers, but not the faces behind them. They read about raids, but not about the slave caravans that had sparked them. So the Guardians of Peace went to Kaleesh as arbiters of order, convinced they were stepping between an aggressive warrior culture and its frightened neighbors. In their reports, the Force felt turbulent around Kaleesh, war leaders dark with anger and grief. Too few sensed that this darkness had been invited, that it had been fed the settlement imposed by the Republic favored, the side with better connections. The Huk received recognition and protection. The Kaleesh received terms, sanctions, tariffs, and penalties that struck not at warriors but at families. Trade routes were cut, medical imports slowed, credits vanished from already thin markets. Famine followed quietly, first on the outer islands, then in the crowded low districts. Disease walked behind it on Kaleesh's wind-scoured plains. Qymaen Jai Sheelal watched proud hunters sell heirloom masks for off-world grain, saw children coughing in dust outside clinics that had run out of supplies months earlier. Then the final blow, the news that the Jedi Council had endorsed the sanctions that the luminous order he had heard of in half-remembered legends had chosen the insect slavers' petitions over his people's graves. In that moment, something in him hardened beyond grief, beyond ordinary rage, and there were others listening in the dark for a warrior whose hatred of the Jedi had finally been given a righteous name. Sanctions, starvation, and the death of Relcry. What followed was not a single battle or a glorious last stand. It was a slow strangulation. Sanctions are a quiet weapon. They do not roar across the sky like gunships. They seep into ports and markets and clinics, until one day a world discovers that the lanes above it are empty. Kaleesh's trade routes were closed by decree on Coruscant, and the effect on the ground was immediate, and merciless medicines that had once arrived in battered crates stopped coming. Replacement parts for water purifiers lay in orbiting warehouses, while village wells turned brackish. The story of Kaleesh in those months was not written in sweeping charges, but in emptied shelves and silent workshops. Hunters found that their trophies could no longer be traded for off-world grain. Mothers walked for days to clinics that had no Bacta, left only stained bandages and apologies. Entire villages slipped into a quiet despair, the kind that does not scream. It only grows. Thinner, colder, more resigned for a warrior like Qymaen Jai Sheelal. This new enemy was an abomination he had spent his life facing claws and chitin and blaster fire conflict. He understood the arc of a spear, the recoil of a rifle. But how did one fight a line of legal text ratified light years away? How did one challenge a Senate committee or a Jedi Council vote that turned Kaleesh into a cautionary example for other rebellious worlds? He raged against it all the same. He traveled between settlements, promising that the sanctions would break before the Kaleesh did yet. Each journey showed him more hollow-eyed elders, more children, with the grey look of slow starvation power in the Galactic Order now belonged to men and women who had never seen Kaleesh's red storms, and to Jedi who spoke of balance while his people wasted away in the midst of this Relcry. Began to fade. Some say an old wound from the Huk War, turned septic without proper treatment. Others that a fever swept through their region. And the last working med-droid had already been sold for food. Whatever the cause, what they found there would change everything for Qymaen. He could not charge this enemy. He could only sit at her bedside and listen to her breathing grow shallow. Days blurred into one another. The proud hunter who had once stalked armored predators now found his hands useless against a failing pulse. He tried, smuggled remedies, folk, cures, whispered by elders, anything that might coax the Force or fortune to spare her. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history, not because it succeeded, but because it failed when Relcry's breath finally stilled in the dim light of their dwelling. Kaleesh's war ended for Qymaen, and another war began. Grief did not burn hot. It cooled. It settled into him like metal, setting in a forge, hard, unyielding. In that silence, the image of distant robed figures on Coruscant fused with the memory of her hand slipping from his. The Jedi had endorsed the sanctions, therefore the Jedi had sanely killed her. From that night, his hatred was no longer the wild fury of a frontline commander. It was precise. It had a name and a direction. This was the moment that would shape everything that followed for millennia to come. The galaxy would remember General Grievous as a cyborg terror who collected Jedi lightsabers like trophies. But the first of those trophies was invisible. It was the absence at his side, the space where Relcry should have stood. In time, metal would replace flesh, and new masters would teach him to channel that hatred, yet beneath the armor, beneath the coughing mechanical frame. The story of his war with the Jedi always led back to a quiet room on a starving world, and a promise that no Kaleesh death would go unanswered again. From Qymaen to Grievous, taking a new name on Kaleesh, the dead were remembered through names and masks, through stories repeated until they hardened into legend. Qymaen Jai Sheelal had carried the name of a hunter, of a protector, and for a time it matched the man. But after Relkrai's death, after the sanctions, the starvation, and the quiet rooms filled with coughing children, something in him shifted mercy. Once a point of pride became a luxury his people could no longer afford. Power corrupts. But what happens when that power is the only barrier between a starving village and annihilation for Qymaen? The answer was simple. The enemy had chosen total war, and what followed was a slow, deliberate unmaking of the man he had been. He began with tactics, raids that once focused on driving the Huk away, turned into operations designed to erase them. Fewer prisoners were taken, fewer warnings were given. Huk outposts that surrendered were shelled from a distance, their banners burning alongside their dead. He learned to strike at night in storms, in the middle of sacred Huk festivals. When panic would spread fastest, he used fear as a weapon, letting survivors flee, just long enough to carry tales of the red-masked general whose mercy had died. With his mate among the Kaleesh, his legend grew. Stories told of a warlord who never slept, who could track a Huk patrol across Bearstone, who never lost a battle. They still saw a hero, a champion fighting for order against a predatory invader inside. He felt only the cold weight of names added to an invisible ledger. Relkrai's name at the top, followed by villages, planets, entire bloodlines. Somewhere in this descent, a new word began to cling to him in the Huk tongue, in off-world reports, in whispered translations among neutral traders. The campaigns of Qymaen Sheelal were called Grievous. Grievous losses, grievous wounds, grievous retaliation on Kaleesh. The term twisted, changed, became a mantle rather than a warning. He accepted it, first as a title, then as a name. Grievous, the one who carried grief and inflicted it in equal measure. This was the story of a man who let his sorrow harden into identity. Qymaen still existed in memories, in old hunting songs, but on the battlefield, on intercepted galactic reports, only Grievous remained. His strategies reflected that new self. He targeted supply lines, civilian hives, command broods. He left ruined husks of Huk cities as monuments to Kaleesh suffering. This was not random brutality. It was calculated demonstration, a message to the galaxy that Kaleesh might be starving, but it was not weak. From orbit, distant observers watched banking clans trace the casualty figures. Republic analysts filed quiet reports. Sith eyes measured the cold efficiency of a warrior who fought like a weapon, pretending to be a man for thousands of years. The galaxy had produced conquerors, but few who embraced war with such focused personal hatred that hatred would shape more than Kaleesh's fading horizon in time. Powerful off-world interests would decide that this grieving warlord could be useful. A commander already half machine in his heart, ready to be remade in metal. What they found there would change everything. The banking clan takes. Notice, off-world interests in the Star Wars galaxy rarely act alone and almost never act openly. Behind the smoke of distant wars sit ledgers, contracts, and quiet signatures. Among the most powerful of these hidden forces was the intergalactic banking clan on the surface. The banking clan was a financial institution, a sprawling web of vaults, credit lines, and mortgage holds that touched almost every major world in the Republic. But credits are a kind of power, and in the Clone Wars era, that power did not remain abstract. The clan maintained its own security forces, entire droid armies of thin, insectile IG series enforcers and hulking hailfire platforms, all justified as asset protection. In truth, it was the skeleton of a private empire, waiting for the right conflict to flesh it out far from Kaleesh, in fortified boardrooms on Munalinst. Analysts pored over reports, the way Jedi studied the Force. They tracked shipping losses, casualty projections, and the rise and fall of planetary warlords. For them, the Huk War was not a tragedy. It was a data set where the Jedi saw suffering, the banking clan saw opportunity. They employed agents, corporate observers, and mercenary spies to move quietly through war zones, measuring not only mineral wealth and trade routes, but something less tangible. Leadership. What followed was a cold search for individuals who could be repurposed commanders, who fought without Republic support, who inspired fanatical loyalty, who already hated the Galactic Order that kept their worlds poor in the Kaleesh warlord. Qymaen Sheelal, their reports began to converge. Here was a commander who had turned a primitive, sanction-strangled world into a match for a recognized Republic-client species. Here was a man whose every victory deepened his hatred of the Senate and the Jedi who had arbitrated against Kaleesh, charismatic, ruthless, marked by the loss of his beloved and the starvation of his people. He was already half broken in. The way the clan required on Moonalinst, certain Moon executives took notice, and they were not alone among their most valuable partners, moved a tall, robed figure whose presence seemed to dim the light in any chamber he entered. Count Dooku of Sereno. Once a respected Jedi Master, now a quiet apostate walking the edge of the dark side, had begun to weave threads that would shape the coming Separatist movement. For thousands of years, the Jedi had believed that financial disputes and border conflicts were beneath the notice of true Sith designs. Dooku, trained by Darth Sidious, understood how wrong that assumption had been. Credits could move fleets faster than prophecy debt could topple a government more cleanly than any lightsaber in the story of the Clone Wars. The intergalactic banking clan would not just fund the conflict, it would help design it. Dooku studied the Kaleesh reports with the same calm interest he once reserved for Jedi archives. Here was a warrior already shaped by loss, already convinced that the Republic was a lie. Here was anger without direction, waiting for a new banner. This was the raw material from which a different kind of general could be forged, so plans were drawn up in quiet conference chambers, not on battlefields. Contracts were amended, shipping routes quietly adjusted, a shuttle schedule noted in a margin. Qymaen Sheelal believed his next campaign would be chosen by his own hand. He did not yet understand that his next great battle had already been arranged for him from the shadows, and that when it came, it would not be a war against the Huk, it would be a war against his own body, an offer wrapped in sympathy. The crash had been planned long before the shuttle ever left the ground, but before metal and fire tore his body apart, there came something softer. There came an offer on Kaleesh. In the uneasy lull between campaigns, representatives of the intergalactic banking clan arrived with polished transports and careful smiles. They did not come as conquerors, they came as benefactors. They walked among broken shrines and half-flooded villages, taking in the scars of a world the Republic had left to bleed. They spoke of reconstruction, they spoke of credit lines, relief shipments, medical facilities, and weapons contracts. They laid out projections on flickering hollows, showing Kaleesh's debt spiraling downward under their guidance, its armies rearmed, its markets reopened to the wider galactic order. At the center of their attention stood Qymaen Sheelal. They addressed him not as a war criminal, but as a strategist whose genius had been tragically undermined by outside interference. They praised his campaigns against the Yamri, his ability to hold a starving world together under sanctions. They called him a guardian of his people, a commander who had done in months what lesser generals could not achieve. In years, what followed was a performance of sympathy. They agreed with quiet conviction that the Republic had failed Kaleesh. They spoke of distant committees that had never seen a Kaleesh child, of Jedi who claimed to serve peace, yet had stood beside the Huk when the sanctions fell. They framed Kaleesh not as an exception, but as a symptom. They hinted at worlds across the Outer Rim abandoned to piracy, famine, and corporate exploitation in their telling. Kaleesh was not alone. It was part of a pattern. This was the story of a galaxy where the strong center grew fat while the edges withered. They suggested gently that for thousands of years the Republic had turned a blind eye to such suffering, unless profit or prestige demanded otherwise. The subtext was clear. If Kaleesh wanted justice, the existing order would not provide it. Qymaen listened. He was wary. He knew off-worlders had brought both war and humiliation to his people. Yet the images were compelling. Shipments of grain, crates of munitions, orbital foundries bearing the banking clan's sigil. They promised loans on favorable terms, advisors to navigate Senate procedures, political backing to challenge the sanctions that kept Kaleesh strangled in slow motion. He heard in their words a path to restore strength and dignity, a way to ensure that Kaleesh warriors would never again fight with rusted rifles against industrial armies. He imagined villages rebuilt, ancestor masks carved in celebration rather than mourning. But beneath the flattery, there was a colder calculus. The bankers evaluated him. The way they evaluated any asset, they measured his charisma, his tactical brilliance, his hatred of the Jedi and the Republic. They saw not a partner, but raw material, a weapon that could be refined, aimed, and unleashed against a corrupt galactic order that no longer served their profit. What they found there would change everything for them. Qymaen Sheelal was an investment for him. Their support would shape the very limits of his own flesh, and the first payment on that hidden contract would come due aboard a shuttle high above Kaleesh, when metals screamed and the dark side quietly took notice. The shuttle, the sabotage, and the last human breath high above the scarred world of Kaleesh. In the quiet between battles, a shuttle waited with its engines humming like a distant storm. Qymaen Sheelal stepped aboard, not as a monster of metal, but as a tired warlord carrying the weight of a dying planet. His cloak still smelled of ash and sea salt from Kaleesh's coast. His thoughts moved between future campaigns against the Huk and the empty space where Ronderu Le Kumar had once walked beside him. He had won battles, shattered Huk lines, taken trophies that would shape legends on his homeworld, but sanctions from the Republic strangled Kaleesh's recovery famine, crept in like a second enemy. The Jedi had come not as saviors, but as distant arbiters, protecting trade routes and banking clan interests, while Kaleesh children starved still. There was a fragile hope in him. The banking clan promised support, munitions, credits, leverage against the Republic. Their emissaries spoke of honor, of investment, of restoring Kaleesh's place in galactic history. Qymaen stared out the shuttle viewport as the world fell away beneath him and imagined new campaigns that might finally end the war. What followed was not a battle, but a decision made in boardrooms and shadowed chambers far from any battlefield. While the shuttle climbed, hidden commands pulsed through its systems in distant space. Count Dooku and the intergalactic banking clan quietly confirmed that their asset was in transit. The Sith had no need for a living legend when a reconstructed weapon would be easier to control mid-flight. The first sign was small, a shudder, a flicker in the light, a faint change in engine tone. Then the world tore open around him. Alarms screamed, the stars outside became a blur as the shuttle lurched into a violent spin. Gravity lost its direction. The deck rose up and then dropped away. Again, metal shrieked as structural supports snapped. The cockpit canopy fractured, spraying shards of transparent steel through the cabin. A console exploded in a burst of fire and shrapnel. Qymaen was thrown against the bulkhead. His ribs cracked. He tasted blood, sharp and metallic, filling his mouth as the air grew thin. The shuttle fell toward a distant world, not Kaleesh, but a nameless grave waiting to be written into the story of the Clone Wars from the outside. It was an accident, a tragic loss of a regional warlord. From the inside, it was a slow-motion dismemberment of a life. Flames crawled along the walls. The roar of atmosphere outside became a constant, grinding howl. His vision narrowed to a tunnel of red and black. Each impact tore another piece from the hull, another memory from the future. He had imagined sensation began to fade in his legs. First, then his arms. His fingers no longer answered his will. The dark pressed in around the edges of his sight in the middle of the chaos. There was a strange, detached calm. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, then slowing one last breath seared his lungs. He felt it leave him, ragged and wet, carrying the taste of smoke and iron. He did not know that in the wreckage, surgeons loyal to Dooku were already waiting, that his shattered body was about to become a battlefield between flesh, machine, and the dark side. His last, fully organic moment ended, not with a scream, but with a question that never reached his lips as his heartbeat faltered. The Sith moved in, and what they found there would change everything for him. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history, and on a cold operating table, far from Kaleesh's red sands, Qymaen Sheelal would awaken to a new name and a new body that no longer belonged entirely to him. rebuilt for war, the birth of the cyborg. The operating theatre was quiet in the way deep oceans are quiet. A heavy silence pressed in around the cold durasteel table broken only by the steady hiss of respirators and the distant hum of power conduits. Sterile white light poured down from articulated lamps, turning Qymaen Sheelal's broken form into a pale anatomy study. Stripped of war paint, stripped of armor, stripped of identity around him, moved tall, thin silhouettes, Kaminoan cloners or their close kin. Long fingers gliding over consoles, large black eyes unreadable. They spoke in low clinical tones about tissue, viability, neural integrity, oxygen saturation to them. This was not the story of a warlord. It was a project, a sequence of procedures to be completed in the correct order. What followed was a dismantling of a person disguised as reconstruction. His shattered legs were addressed first, jagged bone and ruined muscle, excised with precision, replaced by articulated durasteel limbs, each joint built around compact servo motors, each tendon substituted with braided synth muscle cables. The new legs were tested in the air, disconnected from his mind flexing in. Smooth mechanical arcs, like the limbs of a droid that had never known pain. His arms went next. Kaleesh sinew and scarred flesh, removed piece by piece, until only raw connection points remained. Sockets waiting for something colder. Heavier, more obedient segmented forearms were locked into place. Armored plating sealed over anchor rods. Microprocessors calibrated the torque of every movement. The hands were engineered to close with crushing force and delicate control equally capable of holding a ceremonial mask or driving a blade through a Jedi's guard. His chest was opened like a cracked shell, the failing heart and torn lungs suspended in containment fields, while surgeons slid a durasteel cage around his remaining organs. Powerful pumps and filters took over the work. His body no longer wished to do. Life support systems wrapped his core in a permanent embrace of dependency. Every breath from this moment on would be mediated by machines. Through it all, his brain remained untouched, suspended, in a bath of nutrient gel, threaded with cables. His yellow eyes, still living, still organic, watched dim shapes move beyond the transparent steel of his mask. In those eyes, there was movement memory of red sands and the Huk War, the taste of smoke and the sound of distant artillery, trapped now behind a face that was no longer his. In the shadows at the edge of the light, Count Dooku observed hands, folded, expression calm. He asked precise questions about reflex, latency, about pain, suppression, about combat potential. This was not just a rescue. This was designed in the birth of a weapon that would shape the coming galactic war, a commander fashioned to hate the Jedi with every remaining nerve. One final pattern broke the sterile rhythm. A brief pause as a vocal modulator was lowered into place over the remnants of his throat. The surgeons discussed tone resonance, intimidation profiles, as if choosing a color for armor. When it activated the first test, exhalation emerged as a ragged mechanical rasp, the ghost of a breath dragged through metal piece by piece. The process ended a towering frame of armor and servos encasing a single grieving mind somewhere inside the durasteel cage. Qymaen Sheelal receded, and another name waited in the silence. General Grievous, a title Dooku was already rehearsing for the day this living weapon would step from the table and into the wider conflict. Waking up inside a machine. For a moment there was only pressure and sound. Weight pressed down on him from every angle, not the familiar drag of muscle and hide, but a crushing, uniform heaviness. Beneath that weight, something hummed. Servos whirred in patient cycles. Fluid pumped through artificial veins. Power flowed where the Force never had. Then came the first awareness of breath, and it was wrong. Air did not pass over tusks or through scarred Kaleesh lungs. It scraped through filters, turbines, and valves, emerging as a hollow mechanical rasp. Each inhalation echoed inside a durasteel cage, feeding a synthetic organ that beat with perfect, uncaring rhythm. The story of his body had been rewritten without his consent. Light bled in as optic sensors calibrated. The ceiling was cold, clinical, ringed with CIS medroids and moon technicians watching with the stillness of accountants. Somewhere beyond them, cloaked in shadow and composure, stood Count Dooku. When Grievous tried to speak, the sound that emerged was a distorted growl, fractured by speakers and metal plates. Movement came next. He willed a hand to rise, and something obeyed instantly. Too instantly. Taloned durasteel fingers flexed with perfect precision, guided by impulses that no longer had to fight through tired nerves or scar tissue. There was no ache, no resistance, no familiar feedback of flesh and bone. Only motion and the faint, unsettling delay of sound catching up to action as servos turned. He sat up in stages, each segment of his new spine locking with a muted clack. The armor that encased him settled like a mantle of stone, heavy yet effortless to lift. The contrast was disorienting. Stronger than he had ever been in war against the Yamri, faster than in the hunts on Kaleesh, and yet, for the first time, he felt profoundly disconnected from his own limbs. Dooku let the silence linger, then filled it with a carefully edited truth. There had been an accident, he said. A shuttle sabotaged in the depths of galactic space. Republic agents. Jedi oversight. The same order that had once sided with the Huk against Kaleesh had now finished what they began. What followed was a narrative sharpened like a blade. The Republic's indifference, the Jedi Council's cold decisions, and the noble intervention of the banking clan and the Separatist cause that had saved their greatest Kaleesh champion. Grievous listened, the new lungs hissing in steady, involuntary rhythm. Gratitude flickered. Survival was a victory. His people would still have their warlord. The empire of the Republic would still have reason to fear Kali's son. Yet beneath that gratitude, something darker coiled. Horror at the loss of his face, his hands, his scars. The quiet, inarticulate terror of not knowing where Qymaen Sheelal ended and this armored figure began. He tested his legs. They obeyed with predatory grace, pistons compressing, talons scraping durasteel. Stronger, faster, better, Dooku assured him. This act of mercy would reshape galactic history. This new form was a gift, a weapon that would shape the coming conflict. Together, the Count promised, they would make the Jedi pay for what was done to him and to Kaleesh. In the reflection of a polished console, the warrior saw not a Kaleesh, but a mask of bone-white metal and burning eyes. Somewhere behind that glare, a new name waited. And the first time Dooku spoke it aloud, the title hung in the air like a sentence, hinting at campaigns and atrocities still unwritten. Count Dooku's deadly apprentice. The new name was a weapon, and in the hands of Count Dooku, that weapon would be honed in secret. Grievous was moved to secluded training facilities far from the main Separatist fleets, places of cold durasteel corridors and echoing hangars where no civilian eyes would ever see what the Confederacy was creating. There, under artificial skies and the watchful gaze of camdroids, the former Kaleesh warlord was introduced to a new kind of war. No mud, no storms, only polished floors, humming generators, and the clinical precision of the Sith. At first, his opponents were simple. Sparring droids, armed with stun batons and training sabers. Holographic projections of generic duelists, programmed to fall. What followed was a slow escalation that mirrored the dark side's own methodical patience. The droids became faster, heavier, armed with real blades. The holograms became recreations of archived Jedi masters, their forms simulated from temple holo recordings stolen by Dooku's agents. Failure meant dismembered chassis and shattered walls. It never meant rest. Dooku watched all of it. The Count was more than a political leader. He was a scholar of the Jedi arts, a former master who understood every classical form of lightsaber combat. He began to deconstruct those forms in front of Grievous, explaining almost gently how each was meant to flow, how each relied on assumptions about balance, fatigue, and the limits of flesh. Then he inverted them. He showed Grievous where a Makashi thrust left the ribs exposed, where an Ataru leap could be punished by a low rotational strike. In time, the cyborg became a mirror and a counter, a living catalogue of Jedi weakness. To match that design, his body changed. Technicians added extra arms, folding mechanisms that slept beneath his cloak until called upon. Advanced servo motors nested in his shoulders and spine, tuned again and again as Dooku demanded greater speed, greater precision, greater terror. When the limbs unfolded and fought, lightsabers ignited at once. The air itself seemed to recoil. This was not the graceful duel of Jedi tradition. This was a storm of blades. Outside the arena, the obsession deepened. Grievous spent long hours alone before holo projectors, watching slowed recordings of ancient and recent Jedi duels. He memorized stances, catalogued footwork, and rewound the exact moment of each death, imagining different angles, quicker kills, more efficient executions. The story of the Jedi, for him, became a gallery of targets. Their order was no longer an abstract enemy. It was a list of names to be erased from galactic history. Through it all, Dooku's cruelty remained subtle. He praised efficiency, never compassion. He spoke, in low measured tones, of Kaleesh's suffering, of Republic indifference, of Jedi hypocrisy. Each compliment was tied to an act of brutality. Each lesson in the Force's darker philosophies was framed as justice. Over time, Grievous's loyalty ceased to rest on trust or honor. It rested on hatred, sharpened day after day, a hatred that would shape the opening moves of the coming Clone War and set the stage for his first real encounter with the Jedi on the battlefield. The first fallen Jedi and the first stolen saber hatred, once sharpened, seeks an outlet. For Grievous, that outlet arrived not as a duel of honor, but as an ambush dressed up as diplomacy. The Jedi Order believed it understood war, believed it understood warriors like the Kaleesh general, now bound in metal. What followed was a quiet demonstration of how wrong that assumption could be. The first real confrontation came on a shattered moon above a contested world, early in the Clone War. A small Jedi-led task force boarded what they thought was a damaged Separatist command ship. The hull was scarred, lights flickering, droids seemingly offline. To the Jedi, trained for decades, the scene read as familiar. A rescue, a quick strike, a chance to limit casualties. To Grievous, watching through cold photoreceptors, it was a controlled experiment. He studied them through surveillance feeds, tracking every step. The way their hands hovered near hilts, the way they stretched out in the Force before opening a door. He had been taught that Jedi favored predictable patterns, that their discipline was both strength and weakness. In those corridors, he began to test that theory, sealing bulkheads a heartbeat too late, letting them think their instincts had saved them. Each narrow escape was permitted, not prevented. When he finally stepped into their path, cloaked in smoke and dim emergency lighting, he did not ignite a weapon at once. He listened. The lead Jedi called for surrender, invoked the Republic, invoked mercy. Words that had never reached Kaylee. Grievous moved with clinical precision, closing distance, forcing the Jedi to reveal their stance, their preferred form, the angle of their guard. Only when he had mapped their rhythm did he unfurl his extra arms and draw borrowed sabers into the light. The first fallen Jedi was not a Grand Master, not a legendary name. He was a knight, experienced, confident, accustomed to droids that broke under pressure. Grievous broke expectations instead. He attacked offbeat, blades coming from impossible directions, targeting wrists, elbows, knees, the joints that governed motion. It was less a duel and more a dissection. When the final strike came, it was swift, almost merciful. The body fell. The room went quiet. Grievous stood over the corpse, not roaring in triumph, but tilting his head in faint, mechanical curiosity. This was a Jedi. Flesh, bone, and silence. No divine retribution from the Force. No sudden justice for Kaleesh. Just another dead soldier in a long galactic war. He bent, picked up the fallen lightsaber, and turned it over in his metal fingers. The weapon that had failed to save its master hummed softly, a contained shard of power. In that moment, something in Grievous settled. Not joy, not simple bloodlust, but a cold, measured satisfaction. The order that had watched his world starve could bleed. That first trophy did not go to a vault. It hung at his side, a constant reminder. Each new campaign added more. A green blade taken on Christophsis, a blue one claimed in the wreckage of a carrier above Duro. Each hilt carried a memory, a stance overcome, a defense unraveled, another name erased from the Jedi rolls. Over time, this became a ritual. Before battle, he checked their emitters. After victory, he clipped new sabers to his belt with the same deliberate care a priest might give to relics. For Grievous, these were not mere prizes. They were proof that the Jedi were mortal, that the Order which had abandoned Kaleesh could be dismantled one jewel at a time. His collection grew, a traveling graveyard of light, and the story of his hatred spread ahead of him. Yet in the quiet between campaigns, those hilts also whispered a different truth. No collection lasts forever. One day, these blades would lie scattered across battlefields and sealed vaults, mute witnesses to the fall of the hunter who had taken them. Supreme Commander of the Droid Armies. In a galaxy drifting toward open war, symbols mattered almost as much as fleets. The Separatist Alliance did not only need ships, factories, and credits, it needed a face that could terrify the Republic and reassure its own frightened worlds that someone ruthless stood between them and Coruscant. That face became General Grievous. As the Confederacy crystallized under Dooku's guidance, the banking clan, the Techno-Union, and the Trade Federation poured their mechanical legions into a single war machine. At the apex of that new order, they placed the cyborg from Kaleesh, elevating him to Supreme Commander of the Droid Armies. Overnight, Qymaen Sheelal vanished from the galactic record, and in his place rose a manufactured legend, one that would shape the opening years of the Clone Wars. Grievous did not simply receive battalions, he was given sectors. Entire fleets of munificent frigates and recusant destroyers answered his signal. When he descended on a target world, it was rarely subtle. Star destroyers would tear open the sky, landing craft would fall like dark rain, and on the ground, endless ranks of B-1 and B-2 droids advanced in rigid, tireless formation. The story of his campaign spread quickly. Worlds surrendered at the mere hint that the Kaleesh general had set his sights on them. His presence itself became a weapon. Holonet briefings in the Republic replayed the same jagged image. A towering skeletal frame, cloak billowing, eyes burning behind a mask that never smiled. Senators whispered that he was a Sith, a droid, a demon from some forgotten empire. Parents on core worlds used his name as a warning to restless children. The Jedi Council understood the truth more clearly, but the effect was the same. Fear, anticipation, a sense that somewhere in the dark, metal feet were already marching. On the battlefield, his strategy was brutally efficient. Grievous favored sudden strikes and rapid planetary invasions, appearing without warning in hyperspace shadows and vanishing just as quickly. He threw droids forward in waves, uncaring how many fell, using their programmed obedience to grind down clones and exhaust Jedi. Where a Republic general might hesitate to trade lives, he simply recalculated tonnage. If 1,000 B-1s bought a single fallen Jedi and one more lightsaber for his cloak, the equation was acceptable. Among Separatist leaders, opinions fractured. Some, like Newt Gunray, saw him as a necessary monster, a shield of terror behind which they could hoard profit and avoid direct blame. Others, more calculating, recognized that his theatrics drew the Republic's gaze away from quieter schemes in the Senate and the shadows of the Force. While the Republic chased the coughing general from world to world, deeper plans unfolded, unchallenged. Yet the public image of a mechanical demon did not tell the whole story. Inside the armored shell, the mind that directed invasions still remembered Kaleesh's red skies and the faces lost beneath Huk fire. In rare, unobserved moments aboard his flagship, the malevolence or the invisible hand, silence pressed in around him. The trophies at his belt were meant to prove that the galaxy's Jedi could bleed. They also whispered of villages that had never been avenged. What followed was a paradox, a warlord who had become an instrument, a hunter who now served architects he barely knew. As the Clone Wars deepened, that tension between legend and lingering humanity would only grow, and the next campaigns would push General Grievous closer to the edge that had been prepared for him from the beginning. The invisible hand and the art of terror. Grievous's answer to that tension was not reflection, but escalation. If he had become an instrument, then he would become an instrument of fear. The stage for that decision was a warship that would shape the rest of his story. The invisible hand was more than a flagship. It was a moving fortress of durasteel and venom, a dagger of separatist power that cut through the galactic lanes with predatory patience. Its hangars held endless ranks of droids. Its corridors were narrow, dim, and deliberately claustrophobic, designed so that any boarding party would feel hunted long before they ever saw their hunter. From this vessel, Grievous turned war into theater. He favored sudden appearances, ripping his cruiser from hyperspace directly atop a Republic convoy, weapons already primed. Then came the boardings. The lights would fail, alarms would howl, and in the half-dark of a choking corridor, the only color would be the sudden flare of stolen Jedi blades. His cloak would billow in the artificial wind of decompression, metal feet striking the deck in that distinctive, echoing rhythm that preceded so many deaths. To the clones and officers who survived, the details blurred into legend. They spoke of a shadow that moved on all fours along the ceiling, of a coughing specter who laughed without humor as he advanced. This was not accident. It was design. Grievous understood that terror was a weapon sharper than any vibroblade, and he wielded it with the same ruthless precision he had once used on the jungles of Kaleesh. What followed was a campaign of deliberate cruelty. Medical frigates were not simply captured, they were vented into space while distress calls still echoed. Outposts that surrendered too slowly found their command staff executed on open channels, their bodies left where scanners would find them. Civilian transports that harbored Jedi were targeted first, not last. Each act was a message. Resistance would not bring honorable defeat, only annihilation. Republic strategists called it barbaric. In truth, it was cold calculation. Every atrocity forced the Jedi Order to respond, to divide its already strained knights across a dozen simultaneous crises. While one master chased rumors of massacres in the Outer Rim, another was drawn into a trap laid by the invisible hand along a shipping lane. The war became a series of forced choices, each one engineered to erode morale and faith in the Republic's ability to protect its citizens. Over time, the very mention of his flagship created panic. Convoys rerouted at the whisper of its presence. Planetary governors begged for Jedi escorts they could not be given. This was the story of a single warship becoming a symbol of inevitability, of a machine-bound general turning fear itself into strategy. But in the vast swirl of the Clone Wars, patterns emerged. Reports of the invisible hand began to intersect with the paths of two particular Jedi, whose own legend was growing just as quickly. Obi-Wan Kenobi, patient negotiator and relentless pursuer. Anakin Skywalker, brilliant, impulsive, increasingly drawn toward the dark. What they found there would change everything. And the next time their courses crossed Grievous's, the invisible hand would no longer be a distant rumor, but a battlefield none of them could escape. Coughing metal, the flaw in the design. On the bridge of the invisible hand, amid polished durasteel and disciplined droids, there was one sound that did not belong to a perfect war machine. A ragged, tearing cough, echoing through metal ribs and ceramic lungs, cutting through the illusion of invincibility. Power in the Clone Wars often wore a mask, but Grievous's mask could not silence the weakness buried beneath it. His transformation from Qymaen Sheelal into General Grievous had been sold as an ascension, a gift from the Sith and their allies in the Banking Clan. Stronger limbs, faster reflexes, a body purpose-built for galactic war. Yet inside that armored cage, the remnants of a Kaleesh warrior's lungs clung to life, damaged from the very accident that had saved him. What followed was a slow, relentless degradation every time he entered battle, every time blaster fire shook his frame or a lightsaber glanced off his chest plate. In some tellings of the story, the breaking point comes above Coruscant. There, Mace Windu reaches out with the Force, seizes Grievous's plated thorax, and crushes it inward with invisible pressure. Bone, metal, and vat-grown tissue compress together. The Supreme Commander escapes, but the price is permanent, a wet, rasping cough and a constant struggle for breath. In other accounts, there is no single moment of catastrophe, only the wear and tear of endless conflict, micro-fractures in his chassis, shrapnel embedded in synth flesh, chemical residues from harsh environments slowly poisoning what little biology remains. Either way, the result is the same, a flaw in the design, a reminder that this champion of the Separatist cause is not a pure machine of war, but a wounded survivor, lashed to Sith ambitions. The sound of that cough follows him from flagship corridors to shadowed war rooms, an unwanted companion. It infuriates him. For a commander obsessed with control and dominance, each choking fit is a betrayal from within, proof that his body is both powerful and fragile, never fully his own. So he adapts. Grievous learns to fight in bursts, relying on sudden, terrifying explosions of speed rather than prolonged engagements that tax his failing lungs. He storms forward in a hurricane of 4 lightsabers, overwhelms Jedi with shock and spectacle, then withdraws behind ranks of droids before exhaustion can catch him. Intimidation becomes as important as technique. The cloak, the trophies, the monstrous gait, each detail is calibrated to end a battle in the mind before it ever tests his endurance. His cough becomes more than a medical condition. It becomes a symbol, a dark metronome ticking beneath every display of power. This is the story of a warrior rebuilt for perfection, haunted by the sound of his own mortality rattling inside the machine. For millennia to come, droids will be upgraded and Sith empires will rise and fall, but legends of the wheezing general will linger, a cautionary echo about what happens when the quest for the perfect weapon leaves the soul inside it, gasping for air. And as the war grinds on, that echo will follow him to a sinkhole world on the outer rim, where one last duel will finally silence the cough. Grievous versus the Jedi. Patterns of the hunt that sinkhole world is Utapau. But before the last duel in the dark caverns beneath its cities, there is a pattern that repeats again and again across the Clone Wars, a pattern of approach isolation and sudden violence. Grievous does not simply appear in a battle, he arrives as the center of a machine. Columns of droid walkers grind forward in rigid formation. Vulture droids scream through the sky, and behind that metal tide moves the hunched shape of the general. This is the story of a predator who learned to hunt with an army at his back. His first move is always the same: separate the Jedi from their clones, break the line of command, turn a coordinated Republic advance into scattered pockets of resistance. On worlds like Duro and Hyperi, what followed was almost ritual. Droid artillery pins down the clone troopers, cutting sightlines and severing communications. Super battle droids advance in waves, forcing the Jedi to leap ahead to protect their men. Then the trap closes. Magna Guards emerge with electrostaffs whirling, and Grievous drops into the melee in a blur of cloak and metal. The rhythm of his attacks is relentless. 2 hands become 4. 2 blades become many. Lightsabers taken from fallen Jedi ignite in a spinning halo of green and blue around a single core of furious movement. Against masters like Kit Fisto, the duels take on a strange grace. On the watery station above Vassig, the air is thick with steam, the lighting dim and uneven. Grievous lunges with animal ferocity. Fisto yields ground with calm precision. The clash of blades becomes a staccato heartbeat in the dark. At first, the Jedi Order underestimates him. He is dismissed as a droid commander, a curiosity of Separatist engineering. But survivors begin to talk. They describe his opening charge, his preference for closing distance quickly, his dependence on intimidation and spectacle. They note the cough, the stiffness in certain angles of movement, the way his balance falters when more than 2 limbs are engaged at once. Patterns emerge, and those patterns would shape the next encounters. Slowly, the Jedi adapt. Masters share recordings of his duels. They train to ignore the theatrics, the cape, the roar, the sudden explosion of extra arms. They learn that his aggression hides caution, that beneath the performance is a commander who will retreat the moment the odds turn. When clones hold the line, when a second Jedi arrives, when the trap fails, Grievous withdraws into the smoke, leaving only wreckage and the echo of his rage. Each escape feeds that anger. Each narrow defeat chips away at the legend he is trying to build. As the war drags on, he abandons open duels for ambushes, corridors filled with droids, mines buried under temple floors, attrition instead of spectacle. The hunter-prey dynamic that once defined his life on Kaleesh becomes unstable. Sometimes he is the stalking beast in the ruins. Sometimes he is the one being driven back, step by step, by an order he hates but cannot quite destroy. And that tension, the constant shifting of roles between hunter and hunted, will follow him down into the sinkholes of Utapau, where one Jedi general will refuse to be intimidated, and the pattern will finally break. The Battle of Hyperi. A legend is born on another world far from the sinkholes of Utapau. That pattern of hunter and hunted had already reached its purest form. The place was Hyperi, a shattered manufacturing world choked with wreckage and dust, where metal skeletons of droid factories loomed over fields of twisted scrap. It was here in the early Clone Wars that a small Jedi strike force descended, believing they were moving against a simple, separatist stronghold. What they found there would change everything. Hyperi was a trap from the beginning. The Republic cruisers fell from orbit under withering fire, torn apart by hidden artillery and vulture droids. The survivors crashed among the ruins. Their clone escorts scattered their communications, jammed. The Jedi who emerged from the wreckage were surrounded by endless ranks of battle droids marching in disciplined lines through the haze. They were supposed to be the guardians of order. Instead, they were suddenly prey, in a mechanical wasteland for a time training. And the Force held the perimeter blue and green blades carved through metal torsos, droid bodies piled high around the shattered hulls of their transports. But there was a rhythm to the assault waves of droids advancing then, falling, then advancing again. And beneath that rhythm, something else could be heard, a slow metallic cadence echoing through the ruins. Heavy footfalls, deliberate, unhurried, as if the true commander of this army felt no need to rush. The first sign of his arrival was not his voice. It was the sound of droid remains being dragged aside, the clatter of durasteel limbs on stone. Then silence dust swirled in the broken chamber where the Jedi had gathered blasters, went quiet. Even the remaining droids seemed to hold position, and from that cloud, a tall skeletal figure stepped forward, cloak brushing against shattered plating eyes, burning like coals in a skull of polished armor. This was General Grievous, and what followed was not a duel. In the traditional sense, it was a hunt. He spoke only to promise their deaths, then dropped to all fours with a movement that was almost animalistic. His arms split and unfolded, and suddenly there were more hands than should exist, more hilts than any normal warrior could wield. 4 lightsabers ignited in a crackling halo of color, stolen trophies turned into instruments of terror. He did not charge blindly. Instead, he circled, separating the Jedi from one another, cutting them off from overlapping fields of defense. Each rush was calculated a blur of blades that probed for weakness, forcing a master to overextend, driving a knight into a corner. His style mixed the forms he had studied from fallen opponents with an inhuman precision. He used the Force only as an absence, a void the Jedi could not sense or predict. One by one, the strike team fell, armor-scorched bodies thrown aside into the growing ring of wreckage. Only a handful managed to escape. Dragged away by clones and luck, carried from Hyperi on failing transports with the image of a mechanical demon burned into memory when their reports reached Coruscant. The Jedi Council listened in uncharacteristic silence. This was no mere separatist officer, no simple extension of Sith power. The story of Hyperi convinced them that the war had birthed something else, a singular predator who hunted their kind, and from that moment the name Grievous would shape their fears for millennia to come, even as the Council tried to pretend the Order was still in control. Captured chancellors and calculated chaos, the Council's fear of Grievous became prophecy on the night Coruscant burned. War had twisted the galactic capital into a target the Separatists could not resist and the Sith could not ignore. So when the invisible hand dropped out of hyperspace above Coruscant, it was not just another warship. It was a symbol, a dagger aimed at the heart of the Republic. What followed was a carefully staged nightmare. Separatist fleets emerged in coordinated waves. Lucca Hulk carriers and munificent frigates poured turbo-laser fire into the Republic. Defense line ships blossomed into expanding fields of flame, their hulls breaking apart and raining debris into the upper atmosphere below in the endless city lights flickered. Sirens wailed and citizens watched burning wreckage streak across the sky like falling stars at the center of this chaos. Grievous moved with cold precision under cover of the orbital assault. His forces struck. The Senate District Droid Commandos cut through guards and Durasteel alike. Ion blasts, silent security systems, and in the secure office of the Supreme Chancellor, a cloaked figure waited not in fear, but in quiet calculation. Palpatine allowed himself to be taken to the Republic. It appeared to be the boldest separatist victory of the war. Grievous stormed the chamber, his cloak trailing smoke. Magna Guards at his side, he towered over the Chancellor mechanical talons, clamping around the most protected man in the galaxy. This was the story of a triumphant warlord, claiming his prize in reality. It was a Sith Lord changing costume. Grievous saw only a valuable hostage leverage to break the Senate and fracture Republic command. He did not sense the dark side coiled behind Palpatine's calm eyes. He did not know that the man he dragged through ruined corridors and up into orbit was Darth Sidious, the architect of the conflict that had created him as the invisible hand pulled away from Coruscant. The planet below was a tapestry of fire and shadow. Burning cruisers lay half submerged in the atmosphere, their hulls shearing off in slow, catastrophic spirals. Fighter trails crisscrossed like scars across the night side of the world. For thousands of years, Coruscant had represented order. Now it was a battlefield, but the kidnapping was never meant to end the war. It was designed as Theater Sidious needed an audience, Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi. The Chancellor's abduction forced the Jedi Council's hand. The Republic's greatest heroes launched a desperate rescue straight into Grievous's grasp, turning the invisible hand into a stage. Every corridor a trap, every hangar a test of loyalty and power. The duel with Count Dooku. The Chancellor's feigned helplessness. All of it would shape Anakin's descent when the rescue finally shattered Grievous's plans. His flagship quite literally began to come apart. Around him fire tore through decks. Durasteel groaned and snapped escape pods, jettisoned into the maelstrom. Grievous skittered through collapsing hallways. Cloak of flame engines dying beneath his feet. He fled Coruscant coughing, furious, but convinced the war still favored him, unaware that Sidious had already begun steering him toward a remote sinkhole world called Utapau, and what they found there would change everything. Retreat to Utapau. A cornered general, he left the burning skies of Coruscant behind and descended instead towards Silence, a remote world on the Outer Rim, whose name meant little to most of the galactic warplanners. Utapau from orbit, it seemed unremarkable, a dry sphere banded by storms, but as the invisible Hand's successor craft pierced the clouds, its true nature unfolded. Utapau was a planet of wounds, vast sinkholes bored into the crust for thousands of years by wind and water, each one a layered city spiraling down into the dark. At the rim stood pale, wind-swept spires and turbine fields. In the depths glowed rings of habitation lights and landing platforms carved directly into stone. What followed was a quiet retreat, disguised as a strategic redeployment on Sidious's orders. Grievous gathered the Separatist Council and scattered fleets, and funneled them here into the sinkholes. Utapau would be their redoubt, a hidden fortress from which the droid armies could regroup, and the war could continue far from the core worlds. The story of the Clone Wars was shifting from open assault to entrenched survival, and Sidious needed his general alive long enough to play his final move. Grievous obeyed the command, but his temper was frayed. Each transmission from Sidious carried the same calm assurances that the Republic was overextended, that the Jedi were trapped in their own order, that power was still within reach yet. Every recent campaign had ended in evacuation or stalemate. He stalked the hangar galleries of Pol City Cloak, trailing over durasteel plates, coughing in the thin, dry air, irritated by retreat, but still convinced the Jedi could be broken by attrition and fear. His confidence lay in numbers and in terror. He had shattered worlds before he had watched Jedi fall and added their sabers to his collection. The war to him was not lost. It was merely entering a new phase, a phase where he would draw the Republic into unfamiliar terrain and crush them among the sinkholes. He saw Utapau not as a prison, but as a hunting ground to secure it. He turned his attention to the locales. The Utapauan authorities led by Tion Madon met him on windswept platforms, robes snapping in the constant updrafts. Their lined faces betrayed unease. They were neutral administrators, suddenly confronted with the living symbol of separatist power. Grievous did not negotiate. He arrived flanked by ranks of battle droids and towering tri-droids as metal feet clanging against stone. His voice grated through damaged lungs as he informed them that Utapau was now under separatist protection, a polite term for occupation. Their ports would host his fleets. Their sinkholes would conceal his command centers. Any attempt to contact the Republic or the Jedi would be met with immediate reprisal. The droid presence made the threat unnecessary, but he voiced it anyway. Beneath the platforms, work began. Secret hangars were cut deeper into the rock. Munificent class frigates clung to vertical docks like insects clinging to a well wall. Command posts were wired into the city's power grid. The calm howl of the wind through the sinkholes masked the clatter of droid patrols on the upper levels. It seemed quiet, secure, hidden, yet this calm was fragile. Somewhere in hyperspace, a single Jedi general and his clone legion were already being redirected by a whispered report from a frightened administrator. The arrival of Obi-Wan Kenobi would shape not only Grievous's fate, but the final movement of the entire war, and the dark side that had guided the general to Utapau was already arranging their meeting. Obi-Wan Kenobi arrives. The redirection of a single cruiser in the vast machinery of galactic war can feel insignificant. Yet on this day over Utapau, that quiet course correction carried the story of two generals toward its end. Obi-Wan Kenobi descended into the planet's great sinkholes on the back of a Varactyl, the creature's talons scraping stone as it clung to near-vertical walls, its scales catching the dim light from above. With each leap, its shrill call echoed against layered rock, sending ripples of sound through the cavernous city. Carved into the cliffs far below, the ordered geometry of landing platforms and dwellings clung to the sinkhole's sides like barnacles on some ancient wound in the planet's surface. Utapau had stayed neutral on the surface, but neutrality in this war had become an illusion. Obi-Wan's mission was simple in wording and immense in consequence. Locate General Grievous, end the Separatist campaign here, and perhaps end the conflict itself. Moving with practiced calm, he guided the Varactyl to a secluded platform where robed administrators waited, their faces tight with controlled fear. In hushed tones, The Utapau leadership revealed what the Republic had only suspected. Grievous and his droids were not simply passing through. They were buried deep in the lower levels, hidden beneath the city's polite facade. What they found there would change everything for this forgotten world. The administrator's eyes flickered toward the depths, as if the very mention of the general might summon him from the shadows below, while Obi-Wan slipped into the Undercity. Another message climbed in the opposite direction, through encrypted channels and droid relays. It reached Grievous in a fortified command chamber, ringed with tactical displays. The report was concise. A Jedi had arrived, the name followed a moment later, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Grievous's first reaction was irritation. This world had been chosen to be quiet, secure, hidden the dark side that had guided Separatist strategy, promised time to regroup, rebuild. Yet the name Kenobi stirred something closer to anticipation. The cyborg general rose metal limbs, unfolding with insect precision. Cloak dragging across the floor around him hung the trophies of his campaign, stolen lightsabers, each one a fragment of a dead Jedi Order, each one a reminder that what followed was rarely mercy across the sinkhole. The calm before the storm settled into place. Clone battalions received silent orders. Gunships drifted into holding patterns, their silhouettes barely visible against the upper haze. In the depths, droid armies remained on standby ranks of metal soldiers, inert but ready, awaiting a single command. Two very different generals prepared for the same meeting, one guided by the living force, the other by carefully cultivated hatred and the mechanical discipline of the Separatist war machine. When the moment finally came, it arrived without fanfare. Obi-Wan stepped from a high ledge and dropped into the Separatist hangar below Cloak, billowing as he landed among lines of droid fighters, his presence a single human shape in a cathedral of durasteel. Across the polished floor, Grievous turned slowly, eyes narrowing as organ and metal regarded the Jedi who would shape his final chapter. Their confrontation was inevitable. Only the manner of its ending remained unwritten. 4 sabers against 1, the duel on Utapau. For a long heartbeat, the hangar held its breath, metal, droids, and distant war all waiting around 2 figures in the center of the storm. The Jedi general in worn robes and the cyborg warlord wrapped in armor and hatred. This was the story of 2 paths that had crossed the galaxy for years, now finally meeting face to face. Grievous moved first Cloak, sweeping aside as he stepped forward, each motion a calculated display. Of power plates shifted, servos whined, and from within that armored shell, his arms began to split. What had seemed like 2 limbs unfolded into 4 skeletal appendages, durasteel fingers flexing around polished hilts. One by one, stolen lightsabers dropped into his hands, trophies taken from fallen Jedi, now turned back against their order. There was a pause, almost ceremonial then. With a rasping inhale from his failing lungs, Grievous ignited them. All 4 blades flared to life in staggered rhythm, blue, green, and blue, again painting the hangar walls in a restless glow. The sound was a chorus of humming energy, layered over the distant thrum of the galactic war beyond Utapau. Across from him, Obi-Wan simply raised his single weapon. His stance was narrow, his blade held close. Sore Su, the defensive form, refined through years of conflict. His expression remained calm, almost weary. This was not a duel for glory. It was another necessary act in a long, dark history of Jedi and Sith proxies, clashing at the edge of empire and collapse. What followed was a storm. Grievous surged forward in a blur of limbs and light, his 4 sabers spinning into a shield of lethal color, each rotation designed to overwhelm, to batter. Through any defense, the air filled with the staccato crack of colliding blades, with sparks that leapt and died against cold metal. Obi-Wan gave ground but not control. His blade traced tight, efficient circles absorbing, deflecting, redirecting. Grievous attacked high and low, left and right, his cough punctuating each renewed assault, a harsh reminder of the price he had paid for power. Obi-Wan waited within that chaos, letting the general's aggression burn itself out against his guard. Each parry was a calculation, each sidestep a quiet refusal to answer rage with rage. The pattern broke in an instant, A sudden twist of Obi-Wan's wrist, a precise cut, and one of Grievous's sabers spun away, skittering across the floor. Another exchange, another opening seized, and a second hand was shorn from its socket. Metal fingers still locked around a hilt as they fell. The towering cyborg staggered, momentum turning against him piece by piece. Obi-Wan reduced him, another limb severed, another weapon lost until the whirling storm of blades became a lopsided, stumbling fury. The Jedi's restraint stood in stark contrast to the General's mutilated form. One had lost a body to war and hatred. The other had lost friends. A republic, an order, yet still chose control over cruelty. Cornered, armor scorched, and cloak in tatters, Grievous broke away with a final, frustrated roar. He leapt for the nearest escape, a shrieking wheelbike that howled across Utapau's wind-carved chasms. The duel was not yet over, but what they found there would change everything as the chase left the hangar and entered the open, unforgiving light. Blaster fire and burning organs. Grievous's death. Out in that harsh daylight, the chase across Utapau lost the elegance of a duel and became something simpler, a hunt. The terrain was jagged and colorless wind carved the sinkhole walls into layers of stone, while the air howled through them like a distant, restless choir. Grievous's wheelbike shrieked across the rock face, metal claws biting into the surface as it skidded and bounced, his cape torn away. His armor dented his movements, no longer graceful, but angry and uneven behind him. Obi-Wan clung to the lizard mount, exhausted cloak soaked in dust and sweat. The Jedi did not look like a triumphant knight of the Republic. He looked like a tired soldier who had survived too many battles, drawn forward now by duty rather than glory. What followed was not a clash of equals at their peak, but two fading combatants pushed past their limits by a galactic war. Neither truly controlled when the chase finally broke against a rocky outcrop. The illusion of motion ended. Grievous leapt from the bike landing hard, his remaining cybernetic legs grinding as they absorbed the impact he still had. Multiple arms, but not the whirling storm seen in earlier campaigns. Plates hung loose over his frame, one hand empty, the others clutching scorched metal and half-ruined weapons. His cough tore through the wind, harsher, more ragged the sound of organic tissue that had been asked to endure too much machinery. Obi-Wan slid to the ground, lightsaber ready, but his stance was narrower, more guarded. Grievous came at him in short, violent bursts, each step a heavy clang against the stone blades, flashed, then faltered as his servos misfired. He struck with the memory of Sith training, but with a body that no longer fully obeyed. The dark side sharpened his hatred, yet it could not repair the damage time and combat had carved into his frame. The fight devolved into scrambles and grapples. Grievous hurling his mass forward, Obi-Wan forced to abandon form and reach for whatever the battlefield offered. A dropped electrostaff, a fragment of armor, a blaster kicked loose in the chaos. Each exchange shorter, each breath louder, until at last the Jedi saber was gone, and only the small, inelegant weapon remained in his hand. Grievous advanced ribs of durasteel, peeling back with each labored motion, revealing the vulnerable sack of cloned organs suspended in his chest cavity, the last remnant of Qymaen Sheelal beating frantically against a prison of metal. Obi-Wan aimed the blaster. It was not noble, it was not graceful, it was simply necessary. The shot cracked through the wind and vanished into that exposed cage. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then flame bloomed inside him. Small at first, then racing along tubes and wires, the way war had once raced along star lanes. His eyes burned. His remaining limbs spasmed as internal systems cooked from the inside-out smoke, vented through seams in his armor, until the coughing stopped, not with a final dramatic note, but with an absence. A silence that felt heavier than sound. His body collapsed in stages. First, the knees, then the torso, then the head striking. Stone with a hollow clang, pieces of the feared general scattering across the plateau. A hand still locked in a clawed grip, a fragment of mask staring at nothing. The fire guttered, leaving only scorched plating and the faint hiss of cooling metal. In that stillness, there was no cheering army, no Sith master to witness the end, only a Jedi catching his breath beside a pile of burned components and ruined flesh. The story of General Grievous ended not with a grand speech or prophecy, but as wreckage on an anonymous ledge, his campaign of terror reduced to debris, while the wider war moved on. Without him, a once unstoppable commander, now just another quiet ruin in galactic history, Order 66, and the war without him. Yet even as his body cooled on that wind-carved ledge, the true shape of the conflict was already changing elsewhere in the galaxy. The war that had defined General Grievous was ending without him, and not in the way any soldier on either side had imagined it would end, not with parades and treaties, but with a single, quiet command. On Coruscant, the man who had orchestrated Grievous's rise and fall moved to the next phase of his design. Darth Sidious, wearing the face of Chancellor Palpatine, contacted clone commanders scattered across 1,000 battlefields. The order he gave was simple, precise, and utterly devastating: execute Order 66. What followed was not a battle but a turning of guns as millions of identical soldiers suddenly turned on the Jedi who had led them for years. Across the outer rim and deep into the mid-rim forests, mountains and cityscapes became stages for the same grim scene, a Jedi general sensing a disturbance in the Force, turning to question a trusted commander, and then the flash of blaster fire on Felucia Isla Secura, cut down among alien ferns on Nijeto Kiadi Mundi, falling in the snow on Kashyyyk Yoda, feeling the betrayal and answering with his own lethal clarity. The Clone Wars ended as a series of executions, each one framed as loyal obedience to a lawful order. For the clones, it was framed as duty; for the Senate, it was framed as security for the Sith. It was the culmination of a plan that would shape galactic history for millennia to come. And in that vast design, General Grievous was revealed as only one instrument, a terrifying weapon to keep the Republic afraid, to keep the Jedi spread thin, to make the war feel real, while its outcome had been decided long before, on secret worlds and in hidden chambers. With Grievous dead and the Jedi purged, the last pieces fell quickly. The Separatist Council huddled on Mustafar, thinking they had survived long enough to negotiate their place in the new order. What they found there would change everything. Instead of a diplomatic envoy, they received Darth Vader, the apprentice who had replaced Dooku. His arrival marked the quiet extinction of the Separatist leadership. Each viceroy and magistrate cut down in turn, their droid armies awaiting a signal they would never understand. A single command from Sidious rippled through the holonet and into every battle droid control computer across the galaxy. In an instant, the vast metal legions that Grievous had driven from world to world simply powered down weapons, dropping to their sides. Voices falling silent territories that had cost so much blood to capture folded almost overnight into the new galactic empire. For the ordinary citizen, the transition felt like the end of chaos for the Sith. It was the birth of an empire for Grievous. There was only irony. The Kaleesh warlord, who had sworn vengeance on the Republic for abandoning his people, died at the exact moment that Republic itself was being dismantled, replaced by something colder, more efficient and far darker. His hatred had been aimed at a government already scheduled for execution, his entire campaign a prelude to a different kind of rule. And as the Imperial crest rose over former Separatist worlds, the legend of General Grievous began to fade another terrifying name swallowed by a new era of fear. What became of the Kaleesh as the Imperial crest spread across former Separatist territories? Kaylee remained what it had been before the Clone Wars, a wounded world on the edge of galactic concern. The sanctions that had strangled it under the Republic did not vanish with the new order they calcified. The Empire inherited old trade blockades and punitive tariffs and simply left them in place, a quiet cruelty preserved by bureaucracy. In theory, Imperial rule promised order in practice. What followed was neglect. Kaylee lay far from key hyperlanes, its ores and exports insignificant. Compared to richer systems, patrols passed through only rarely. Stormtrooper boots touched its soil, more for census and intimidation than aid. There were no reconstruction grants, no relief convoys, no tribunals for the Huk commanders who had burned Kaleesh villages and fed the resentment that would shape Qymaen Sheelal's life. For a brief moment, Imperial intelligence did look back toward this forgotten world, Grievous's origins were a curiosity in certain reports, a footnote in military briefings, the planet of the cyborg general, the hunter who had become a terror of the Clone Wars. But the Empire valued power, not justice. There was no effort to lift sanctions, no trials for corrupt Republic officials who had once sold Kalee's suffering to the intergalactic banking clan. The Empire simply folded those old arrangements into its own machinery and moved on the surface. Little changed. The red mists still rolled across Kalee's jagged coasts. Bone totems still clattered in the wind over half-starved villages. But in the stories told around low fires, something had shifted. The story of Qymaen Sheelal and the legend of General Grievous began to pull apart into two different figures among many Kaleesh elders. Qymaen remained the hero warrior, the masked hunter who had led campaigns against the Huk, who had fought while the Jedi looked away. They spoke of his skill stalking. Jungle predators of the ornate masks carved to honor his victories. They remembered a man betrayed by off-world courts and galactic politics, a champion driven to desperation by a distant senate that had never seen Kalee's skies. Others whispered of a different legacy. Parents who had watched hollow footage of burning worlds during the Clone Wars spoke of General Grievous with unease. They had seen the metal skull, the spinning ring of sabers, the Jedi who fell in pieces on polished starship decks. Some said the off-worlders had stolen Qymaen's body, and soul turned him into a weapon of the dark side. Others muttered that he had chosen that path, that the hunter had let hatred hollow him out, until only the machine remained in response. New masks were carved in the bone dust workshops of Kalee. Some followed ancient designs, long snouts and sweeping horns, but more and more bore sharp, angular lines and narrow eye slits, echoing the armored face that had glared from Separatist. Hollow projectors. Children played at being Grievous in the dust, clacking makeshift limbs together, while elders watched in silence, unsure if they were honoring courage or rehearsing a warning over time. Those masks took on a dual meaning. Warriors wore them into ritual hunts as symbols of relentless pursuit. Shamans hung them at village edges as talismans against becoming what Qymaen had become. A reminder that rage could draw the gaze of distant powers, Sith Jedi empires, all using small worlds as pieces in larger games on quiet nights. When the winds off the sea sounded like distant engines, the elders still told the tale. They spoke of a hunter who left Kalee to win justice for his people, who entered the metal coffin of a shuttle and emerged as something else, a monster to the galaxy, a ghost to his own world, a son of Kalee who never came home, and somewhere beyond the Imperial occupation, beyond the fading echoes of the Clone Wars, that unfinished story waited for another generation to answer. Whether his path was a curse to flee or a fate to reclaim, monster, victim, or something in between. In the quiet that follows his transformation, the question lingers like smoke in a ruined temple. Was General Grievous a monster, a victim, or something trapped uneasily between those names? The story of his life is not a single fall from grace, but a chain of turning points, each one tightening the grip of the dark side around a wounded heart. It began on Kalee in the Huk War, when Qymaen Sheelal led hunters and warriors against the Yemri invaders. He fought to drive them from Kaleesh soil, to keep villages from burning and children from disappearing into chittering darkness. What followed was not triumph, but punishment. The Republic listened to Huk petitions, not Kaleesh pleas. Sanctions strangled Kalee. Trade famine crept across the Red World, and the Jedi arrived not as saviors, but as enforcers of a distant galactic order. Relcry's death cut deeper than any sanction. The woman who hunted beside him, who shared his gods and his scars, fell to Huk weapons while the Republic looked away. Grief hardened into something sharper. He carved her mask into his armor, and every battle after that was a prayer and a curse. Combined, had the Jedi stood with Kalee instead of the Huk, had the Senate sent food instead of embargoes, the path ahead might have bent in another direction. Instead, there was the shuttle, the promise of new weapons and credit, a chance to keep fighting. Then the explosion over space, like an angry star blooming in metal and fire. Count Dooku and the banking clan had arranged everything. The sabotage, the rescue, the offer of life in exchange for obedience. What they found there would change everything. A broken Kaleesh warlord whose hatred of Jedi could be sharpened into a weapon of the Sith. His reconstruction was not healing. It was design, Qymaen-grown enhancements, Durasteel ribs over a stolen heart-lungs imprisoned in armor. His body became a cage built for war. He did not choose the shape of that cage, but he chose how to move inside it. Under Dooku's training, he learned lightsaber forms meant for Jedi flesh and turned them into a whirling storm of 4 stolen blades, and yet choice never fully vanished. He ordered massacres. He sanctioned terror campaigns. He reduced worlds to ash to draw the Jedi out. He laughed at burning cruisers and kept trophies from the dead. This was not mercy. This was not defense. It was cruelty, honed into doctrine. Holding these truths together is uncomfortable. He was a perpetrator of horrors and a product of them, a symbol of how an empire's indifference and a dark order's manipulation could twist a defender into a scourge for millennia to come. The Clone Wars would remember him as a monster. Kaylee would remember him as a son taken and remade, and history would struggle to decide which memory was more true. The man inside the armor. Qymaen's ghost. In the middle of that confusion lies a quieter question, one that the galactic war never stopped to ask when the armor marched and the sabers spun. Was Qymaen J. Sheelal truly gone? Or did something of him remain watching from behind the Durasteel and synthflesh? There are moments in the record, small anomalies buried inside the carnage, that suggest an echo of the man he had been. In some campaigns, Grievous allowed evacuation shuttles to launch before bombarding a world delaying fire, just long enough for civilians to escape. Commanders called it intimidation, a way to spread fear. But Qymaen had once ordered his warriors to let Huk non-combatants flee the killing fields. Because dead farmers did not win wars, that pattern would shape more than one engagement in the Clone Wars, and it hints at an older code bleeding through his rages. Tell a similar story when a Jedi spoke piously of balance or the will of the Force. Grievous often reacted with disproportionate fury, not the cold efficiency of a droid general, but a wounded veteran hearing the same. Justifications that had abandoned his people to starvation. This was the story of the Kaleesh War, replayed in every briefing chamber, and what followed was a flash of hatred, too personal to belong to a mere separatist asset. Even his trophies carry the shadow of Qymaen's past. The galaxy saw a monster jangling with captured lightsabers, but Kaylee hunters kept masks, skulls, and carved bones of the great beasts. They slew, not only as boasts, but as reminders of trials survived. Grievous arranging hilts in his cloak lining, studying their weight and balance in the dark between battles feels less like random cruelty and more like a twisted continuation of those rituals. The faces of fallen Jedi, turned into a new kind of bone mask underneath that ritual, sits a deeper obsession with control. Once Qymaen had stood helpless while sanctions strangled Kaylee, an orbital fire rained down beyond his reach. Later, a manufactured accident tore his body apart without his consent. What they found there would change everything for Dooku and the banking clan. But for Qymaen, it meant waking in a frame he had never chosen. From that day, his entire existence became a denial of helplessness. More arms, more sabers, more drills, until every duel was a rehearsal against the memory of powerlessness. Yet the illusion never fully held every ragged cough, every strained wheeze from the ruined lungs in his chest betrayed the fragility inside the armor. Each time his organic eyes blinked behind the mask, there was a reminder that something living still stared out through the skull-like visage. Qymaen was not redeemed. He did not turn away from the dark side, but he remained present, a passenger trapped in the story of General Grievous, as the galaxy wrote over his name. The tragedy is not that he died a villain, but that long before Utapau, a man had been edited into a symbol, and the war had no place for anything more complicated than that. And as the Clone Wars dragged on, that buried presence would meet its final test, on a sinkhole world far from Kaylee, where an old wound and a young general would finally intersect. Legends, canon, and the many lives of Grievous. On that sinkhole world, the past that had been edited away met the legend that had replaced it. And in that collision, another truth emerges. The story of General Grievous is not a single clean line in galactic history. It is a prism, different angles, different colors, the same dark core. In the oldest tellings, he is not yet Grievous at all, but Qymaen Sheelal, a Kaleesh hunter who walked the red dust of Kaleesh with a rifle on his back and a bone mask on his face. Those tales speak of the Huk War, of insectoid Yumri raiders tearing into Kaleesh villages, and of a proud warlord driving them back with guerrilla tactics and ruthless ambushes. What followed was a slow strangling rather than a single decisive battle sanctions from the Republic Jedi intervention on behalf of the Huk, and a world pushed toward famine while its defender learned to hate cloaks and sabers he had never met. That version belongs to legends, to novels, comics, and guides written in the long quiet years between films. There, the intergalactic banking clan watches Qymaen from afar, engineers a shuttle explosion, and presents the wreckage to Count Dooku. As an opportunity, banking droids tamper with controls the ship falls. Dooku arrives as savior, and what they found there would change everything. A shattered body, a still-burning will, and a mind that could be pointed like a weapon. In that continuity, his transformation is a conspiracy. The Kaminoans rebuild him into a towering cyborg frame, his brain and vital organs suspended in armor, his name stripped away, his grief redirected. The brutal warlord is recast as a tragic victim whose hatred of the Jedi is not born in a lab, but in the memory of a starving homeworld and a lover buried beneath Huk Chitin. Canon is quieter about all of this. The animated series and films do not linger on Qymaen, on Kaleesh, or on the banking clan's sabotage. They focus instead on the finished product, General Grievous, the supreme commander of the Separatist Droid Army, a theatrical terror who sweeps into battles with a cape full of stolen lightsabers and a cough that sounds like rust in the lungs. In these tellings, his role is to keep the Clone Wars burning, to be the blade that makes the Jedi Order bleed. Different mediums emphasize different masks in the 2D Clone Wars micro-series. He is almost a horror figure, a skeletal predator dismantling Jedi with inhuman precision. In later 3D animation, he becomes more of a grandiose villain, still deadly but prone to retreat and rage. In some comics, the tragic undertones return. In others, the dark side simply enjoys the spectacle for this quiet narrative. These shards have been woven together into a single life. A Kaleesh war hero, a manipulated survivor, a cyborg general, stalking the edges of a manufactured war. The contradictions do not cancel each other. They deepen the silhouette like conflicting battle reports filed long after the smoke has cleared for thousands of years. Histories in the Star Wars galaxy have been written by victors and archivists, by Jedi chroniclers and Imperial propagandists. Grievous lives in the gaps between those records seen from one angle. He is a monster from another, a casualty of an older conflict, and from a third, a theatrical symbol of the war's machinery. Turning on its own, these variations are not errors. They are echoes. Each medium reaches for the same haunted figure and traces a different contour around him as the Clone Wars move toward Utapau. And the last days of this cyborg general, the story that follows, will treat all of these versions as reflections in the same dark water. Different ripples, same depth. Echoes in the Empire and beyond. Different ripples, same depth. And even after his last spark faded on Utapau, those ripples kept moving through the galactic dark. In the age of the Empire, the Clone Wars became required reading. For a new generation of officers, power was now centralized under Palpatine, but his admirals and Moffs still studied the campaigns of the past on holotables and in war colleges. Grievous's blitz assaults on worlds like Duro, his terror raids on medical stations, his habit of striking supply lines instead of fortresses, all were dissected and reassembled into doctrine. What followed was a cold translation of one cyborg's fury into an empire's calculated strategy of fear. Imperial tacticians noted how his sudden hyperspace jumps created the illusion that he was everywhere. At once, they adapted this into rapid strike fleets and demonstration bombardments, a single Star Destroyer hanging over a rebellious city, could echo the dread once carried by a Separatist flagship hovering above a clone outpost. The story of General Grievous became a case study in how spectacle could break morale long before bodies broke on the ground far from Coruscant's archives on dust-choked Outer Rim worlds. His name survived in a different form there. Parents whispered about a metal warlord who stole children that wandered too far from the settlements. Smugglers claimed to have seen old munificent frigates drifting in deep space, still broadcasting his command codes. Scavengers spoke of droid battalions that woke when approached, their photoreceptors flickering to life and repeating a single word, General. These rumors were rarely true, but in a galaxy scarred by war, truth mattered less than memory. Among refugees who had watched droid columns march through their streets, Grievous lingered as a ghost story, a reminder that the machines of the Clone Wars were never entirely gone, only buried for the scattered Jedi who survived Order 66. His image cut even deeper. Some remembered him as a blur of lightsabers and claws, others as a coughing presence at the edge of the battlefield. But with time, the details softened. What remained was the outline of a being carved apart and rebuilt for conflict, a living warning of what war could do when guided by the dark side and by masters who saw sentient lives as raw material. Later Force users, those who pieced together fragments of Jedi and Sith history, would see a pattern in his fate. A Kaleesh warrior shattered in a shuttle accident, engineered by the very powers that promised him victory. A body remade by Qymaen science, a mind reshaped by Count Dooku. This was not only the story of one general, it was a template empire's rise and fall, but the habit of turning broken people into weapons endures from the Sith experiments of ancient Qymaen to the child soldiers of the First Order. The same design would shape events for millennia to come. Take a wounded soul, offer purpose, strip away. Choice, call it destiny, and send it to the front lines. And somewhere in that long procession of forged monsters stands Grievous, coughing in the dark, waiting for the next war, to prove that his era never really ended, because as the Clone Wars close in around Utapau, another figure is already watching the general's every move, and what they found there would change everything. From Kaleesh's red skies to Utapau's dust, a quiet recap. From a distance, the story of General Grievous looks simple. A coughing machine, a villain of the Clone Wars, cut down by a Jedi hero, but up close. In the half-light, it becomes something slower and sadder. A long arc that begins under red Kaleesh skies and ends in Utapau's pale dust. On Kaleesh, he was Qymaen Sheelal, a hunter, walking the bone fields with a spear in his hands and storms rolling over the horizon. He learned to track great predators in the dark, to move with patience, to strike with precision when the hook came from off-world. What followed was not a glorious clash of empires, but a grinding invasion that burned villages and filled shrines with the dead. The Republic's distant judgment fell against his people. Sanctions instead of aid. Jedi blades raised in defense of the insect warlords who had broken his home. That choice would shape everything. It turned a proud warrior into a general of vengeance. He carried masks and trophies long before he carried sabers, each one a promise that the galaxy would remember Kaleesh when the shuttle exploded over space and fire took his flesh. It was not an accident, but he never truly knew that Dooku and the banking clan had already marked him as useful wreckage. They gathered what was left and wrapped it in metal plating and durasteel claws, leaving a heart that still remembered dust and rain. Reborn as General Grievous, he became the Separatists' supreme commander, a weapon that could speak in strategy and scream in combat halls. He trained under Count Dooku, learning to read Jedi footwork to turn their own forms against them. 4 arms unfolding in a blur of green and blue light, each captured lightsaber, a small shard of a larger grudge. He hunted not just for victory, but for symbols of a broken trust. Every duel, another echo of that first betrayal when the Republic had stood with the Huk during the Clone Wars. His name traveled ahead of him, whispered through trench lines and starship corridors. Entire worlds saw only the monster, the coughing terror at the head of a droid army. Yet beneath the armor, there was still the outline of Qymaen, a man who had lost too much and been offered an outlet that looked like purpose. The Force did not flow through him as it did through Sith and Jedi, but the dark side fed on his grief all the same. turning memory into momentum and sorrow into strategy on Utapau. The circle finally closed. Obi-Wan Kenobi dropped into the sinkhole city like another off-world invader, calm precise, a single Jedi facing the product of a lifetime of war. Their duel scattered blaster fire and sparks across the landing platforms until a single shot found the fragile organs hidden behind that armored shell. In the silence after his burning corpse fell, the galaxy did not hear Qymaen's name, only the end of a campaign, one more marker on a galactic timeline. In the end, his life shows how war erases names, how grief can be weaponized until it looks like loyalty, and how even monsters have origins written in very human pain. For thousands of years, armies will rise and fall. Empires will trade one uniform for another, but the pattern remains: take a wound, deny justice, offer power in its place, call it destiny, and send it back into the fire. And somewhere far above Utapau's dust, another conflict is already beginning to turn his story into precedent, drifting away with the ghosts of the Clone Wars. His story becomes precedent, and then it becomes something even quieter. It becomes background noise in a galaxy that never really stops moving around it, because General Grievous is only one thread in a much larger tapestry of war and memory. And the force around him, the Clone Wars, stretch out like a storm front across the stars. Jedi Knights racing from battlefield to battlefield, Sith Lords hiding in plain sight, clones bred for obedience, fighting and dying on worlds they will never see again. And in the middle of all of that stands a coughing cyborg from Kaleesh, whose hatred is only one note in a far greater chord. The story of Grievous is the story of how the galaxy treats its wounds. Some are bound in honor and allowed to heal. Others are buried under metal plates and called improvement. And what followed was predictable. The dark side took every unhealed fracture, every denied injustice, and turned it into more soldiers, more super weapons, more names on memorials that would fade in the rain of 1,000 forgotten worlds. For thousands of years, the pattern has remained. The details change, the armor changes, the flags over each new empire change, but the cycle endures. A republic becomes an empire, a liberator becomes a tyrant, a victim becomes a weapon. Figures like Grievous are shaped by that cycle, and then in turn would shape it. Their rage becomes a justification. Their atrocities become a lesson for the next generation of extremists waiting in the shadows far from Utapau. The Jedi speak of balance. The Sith whisper about power and destiny. The Force flows through all of it, indifferent to rank or uniform. It watched ancient dark Jedi fall into exile. It watched Sith empires rise from the tombs of Korriban. And for millennia to come, it will watch new wars ignite over old grievances, while most of the beings who suffer through them will never earn a name in any chronicle. Somewhere in that darkness, other lives are still unfolding. A clone commander staring at his helmet long after the battle is over. A nameless Padawan trying to sleep between hyperspace jumps. A merchant on a backwater moon listening to distant news of worlds he will never visit. Each of them has a quiet history, a chain of choices and losses that could fill another long, slow journey through the galactic past on some other night. Another of those paths can be followed. Another forgotten general, another hidden Sith, another world that burned and was never mentioned again. And if this calm descent through one warrior's life has brought even a small measure of order to the chaos of the Clone Wars, more stories like this can wait in the dark, ready to keep silent company. Whenever rest is needed, for now, the image narrows to 3 small points of light. The stars over Kaleesh still shining on oceans and red stone, the empty armor left on Utapau cooling under foreign skies, and the distant spiral of the galaxy itself humming softly as it turns long after the last blaster shot has faded, long after any one soldier, any one Jedi, any one cyborg general is gone.